The concept of silence was a pillar of Aethelgard hegemony philosophy, a state of perfect order where all chaotic noise had been refined into a single, harmonious hum. Aboard the archival vessel Sanctum, this principle was made manifest. The ship was a testament to purity, its corridors carved from a seamless, bone-white polymer that absorbed sound and light, its air filtered to a sterile perfection that carried no scent, its crew, the Ethel, moving with a liquid grace that produced no jarring footfalls. They were a people of sublime control, their tall, slender forms exuding an aura of placid superiority, their pale, luminescent skin unmarked by the messy struggles of lesser species. High Adjudicator Vexia, curator of the hegemony's official history and architect of its narrative of righteous purification, found this silence to be the most beautiful music in the galaxy. She stood on the observation deck of the Sanctum, a vast chamber where the only feature was a floor-to-ceiling window of flawless crystal, looking out upon the star-dusted void. Her robes, the color of fresh snow, pooled around her feet, and her long, elegant fingers were steepled before her, a gesture of thoughtful repose. They were traversing the Viridian Veil, a nebula whose gaseous clouds had long ago been catalogued, tamed, and rendered predictable by hegemony science. This voyage was ceremonial, a pilgrimage through the sectors that had been clarified centuries ago, a reminder of the peace the hegemony had brought to a once cacophonous galaxy. It was a testament to her life's work, the codification of the past into an unassailable truth, a truth that proved the hegemony's ascendance was not conquest, but destiny. The first discordant note in the Symphony of Silence was not a sound, but a feeling. It was a subtle, pervasive tremor in the ship's psychic ambiance, a flicker of static in the collective consciousness that connected all Aethel. Vexia felt it as a brief, unpleasant coolness, like the touch of damp soil, a sensation so alien and viscerally organic that she dismissed it as a momentary lapse in her own meditative focus. But then it came again, this time accompanied by a phantom scent in the sterile air, the smell of wet leaves and rich earth after a rain. It was impossible. The ship's atmospheric processors were infallible, designed to scrub any molecule that deviated from the approved composition. Yet, the scent lingered in her mind, a ghost of a world she had never known. She turned from the window, her placid expression tightening by an infinitesimal degree. Across the chamber, two junior archivists paused in their work, their heads tilted as if listening to a distant, unheard melody. One of them, a young acolyte named Lyran, met her gaze, his own silver eyes wide with a faint, un-Ethel-like confusion. He said nothing, for to voice such a disturbance would be to give it credence, but the question was plain in his look. Vexia gave a subtle, dismissive shake of her head, a silent command to return to their duties, to ignore the flaw in the pattern. They obeyed instantly, their movements once again smooth and deliberate, but the perfect harmony of the room had been broken. The silence was no longer placid, it was strained. Over the next cycle, the disturbances grew, spreading through the sanctum like a contagion. It began in her domain, the archives. The sanctum was less a vessel and more a living library, its core containing petabytes of curated history stored not on drives, but within crystalline data matrices that hummed with quiet light. The official record of the mycelian cleansing, one of the hegemony's foundational triumphs, began to glitch. The mycelians, as the record's Vexia herself had authored stated, were a primitive, fungal-based species, a chaotic infestation on their homeworld of Mycos. They lacked a centralized intelligence, communicating through uncontrolled spore bursts of raw, messy emotion. They were a planetary plague, and the hegemony had administered the cure, a nanophage that rendered their entire biosphere sterile, turning a chaotic world of uncontrolled growth into a placid, silent monument to order. The historical entries were clear, concise, and emotionless. Yet now, phantom data began to surface. A single frame in a pick log of a cleansed forest would flicker, revealing for a nanosecond a world not of chaotic blight, but of breathtaking, bioluminescent beauty. A transcript of an Aethelgard commander's final report would be corrupted with a single, untranslatable word that, when analyzed, carried the emotional resonance of profound, communal grief. Vexia descended into the heart of the archival core, a cavernous space where pillars of glowing crystal pulsed with the slow, steady rhythm of stored information. She ran a diagnostic, her long fingers dancing over a console of pure light. The ship's logic engines reported no external intrusion, no malware, no technological failing. The system was, by all metrics, perfect. Yet the corruption persisted, like a weed pushing up through a perfectly paved stone. The scent of damp earth was stronger here, and she saw crew members subtly rubbing their temples, their placid expressions strained with the effort of maintaining composure. They were beginning to report shared, waking dreams, fleeting visions of towering, luminous mushrooms and forests where the ground glowed with a soft, blue light. They spoke of a feeling of being watched not by eyes, but by the forest itself, a sense of a vast, sleeping consciousness just beyond the veil of their perception. These were not the actions of a technological enemy. This was not warfare as the hegemony understood it. This was a violation of the mind, a defilement of the sacred silence within. Vexia felt a cold knot forming in her gut, an emotion so unfamiliar she could not immediately name it. It was the precursor to fear. She sealed the core, ordering a full data integrity scan, a process that would take hours. She needed to isolate the phenomenon, to study it, dissect it, and erase it. As she ascended back to the command deck, she found Lyran waiting for her, his composure finally beginning to fray. "High Adjudicator," he began, his voice a low, urgent whisper that was itself a transgression against the ship's decorum. "The resonance, it's coalescing. It is no longer random noise. It is forming a query." Vexia's silver eyes narrowed. "Define the query." Lyran swallowed, a nervous, biological reflex that the Ethel had spent millennia trying to refine out of their genome. "It repeats. In the low-level psychic field, it asks the same question over and over." He paused, as if afraid to give the words voice. "It asks, where did you plant our heart?" The question was nonsensical, the ramblings of a ghost in the machine. The mycelians had no heart. They were a diffuse, non-sentient collective. The hegemony had not planted anything. It had sterilized, erased, and purified. And yet, the question echoed with an undeniable sense of purpose, a deep and mournful intelligence that contradicted every historical record she had ever written. It felt less like a question and more like a key, turning a lock deep within the ship's and her own consciousness, determined to crush this phantom heresy. Vexia ordered a psychic dampening field to be activated throughout the sanctum. The low hum of the ship's engines deepened as the emitters came online, generating a wave of null psionic energy designed to smother any stray thoughts, any chaotic, emotional energy. For a moment, it worked. The phantom smells faded, the subtle pressure in the air eased, and the silence returned, albeit a heavier, more oppressive version than before. Vexia allowed herself a brief sense of triumph. She had imposed order. She had reinforced the silence, but the victory was fleeting. The psychic intrusion did not retreat. It pushed back. It met the dampening field not with equal force, but with a terrifying subtlety. Instead of a broad, ambient question, the entity focused its power. The main holographic display on the command bridge, a three-dimensional star chart of the Viridian Veil, began to flicker violently. Technicians rushed to their consoles, reporting massive, unexplainable energy surges from the archival core. The humming of the dampening field rose in pitch, becoming a strained, agonized whine. The white polymer walls of the bridge seemed to darken, and for a terrifying second, Vexia saw faint, spectral patterns of glowing moss and intricate fungal latticework spread across their sterile surfaces before vanishing. The crew gasped, a collective, involuntary sound of shock that shattered the ship's discipline. Then came the scream. It was not a sound that traveled through the air, but an explosion in the mind, a psychic shockwave of pure, concentrated agony that bypassed the dampening field entirely. It was the feeling of 1 billion lives being extinguished at once, a memory of fire and chemical death that was so vivid, so real, that Vexia staggered back, clutching her head. Crew members collapsed to their knees, their serene faces contorted in a pain they had never known. The historical record of the mycelian cleansing was no longer a detached report. It was a sensory experience, and they were all being forced to live it. Through the psychic maelstrom, a new image forced its way onto the holographic display. The star chart dissolved into a swirling vortex of light, which then resolved into a single, impossibly detailed object. It was a spore. It was no larger than a fist, yet it contained a universe of complexity. Its surface was a fractal of crystalline structures and softly pulsing light, and it seemed to thrum with an ancient, powerful life. It floated in the center of the bridge, a silent, beautiful, and utterly terrifying accusation. As Vexia stared, her mind reeling from the psychic assault, the entity's voice finally spoke, clear and resolute, not through the ship's comms, but directly into the core of every Aethel's being. It was a voice that was not one voice, but millions, a choir of minds speaking in perfect, sorrowful unison. We gave you our world to walk upon. The collective voice resonated, filled with an ancient, patient grief. We gave you our air to breathe. We offered you the song of our roots, and you gave us only silence. The voice was not angry. It was not vengeful. It was worse. It was disappointed, like a parent gazing upon a child who had committed an unforgivable sin. Vexia pushed herself upright, her body trembling with a combination of psychic trauma and dawning, catastrophic understanding. She looked at the floating spore, then at the faces of her crew. Their placid certainty shattered, replaced by the raw, chaotic terror they had so long disdained in others. She had dedicated her life to curating a history of righteous order, to proving that the hegemony had brought peace by erasing the galaxy's imperfections. Now she understood. The hegemony had not merely sterilized a planet. They had tried to murder a god, and the ghost haunting her ship was not the memory of its death, but the first stirrings of its awakening. The silence had been broken not by an enemy, but by a truth she had buried alive, and it had learned to scream. The psychic scream receded, leaving behind a silence more profound and terrible than any the hegemony had ever engineered. It was the silence of a vacuum, the absolute zero of spiritual certainty, where the comforting hum of ethel philosophy had once resonated. Vexia's first instinct, an impulse born from a millennium of disciplined thought, was to restore order. She pushed herself to her feet, her white robes now feeling less like a symbol of purity and more like a funeral shroud. "Contain it," she commanded, her voice strained but unbroken, a fine crack in a flawless crystal. Purge the display, sever the link to the archival core, and reinforce the psionic dampeners to maximum output. But her words fell into a void of inaction. The crew of the command bridge remained frozen, some on their knees, others slumped over their consoles, their silver eyes wide and vacant, locked in the shared memory of a world's death. They were not disobedient. They were broken. The truth, delivered as a raw sensory blast, had overloaded their meticulously ordered minds. Only Lyran, the young archivist, seemed to retain a sliver of himself. He was staring at the floating spore, not with the terror of the others, but with a kind of awestruck, horrified reverence. "High Adjudicator," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's not an attack. It's a memory. It's singing." And Vexia, in the terrifying new quiet, could almost feel it too, a low, thrumming vibration emanating from the holographic image, a song of sorrow so deep it felt like the foundational frequency of the universe. Her attempt to impose order had failed before it began. This was not a problem to be solved with protocols and purges. This was a reality to be survived. Ignoring her own commands, Vexia approached the holographic spore, the source of her world's unraveling. It pulsed with a soft, internal light, its intricate surface shifting in patterns that were not random, but seemed to follow a complex, organic logic. As she drew closer, the scent of damp earth and the phantom feeling of cool moss underfoot returned, no longer a subtle intrusion, but a constant, ambient presence. The sterile air of the sanctum was becoming rich, loamy, and alive. She reached out a hesitant hand, her long, pale fingers stopping just short of the projection. The light from the spore seemed to reach back, casting shifting, fractal patterns across her skin. The entity's voice, the chorus of a million minds, spoke again inside her head. But this time it was not a proclamation, it was an offering. "See what you erased," it whispered, and the image of the spore dissolved. The holographic display did not go dark, it became a window. Vexia was no longer looking at a projection on her ship's bridge, but was gazing into the heart of Mycos as it had once been. She saw forests of colossal, glowing fungi that pulsed in a slow, silent symphony of light. She saw rivers of liquid phosphorescence flowing through valleys carved from living crystal. She saw sentient clouds of spores drifting through the canopy, communicating not with words but with shifter waves of color and emotion, joy, curiosity, contentment. It was not a world of chaotic, mindless blight. It was a single, interconnected organism of breathtaking complexity and peace. It was a garden, and the Ethel had been the fire. The vision shifted, showing her the arrival of the hegemony. The sterile white Aethelgard ships descended like shards of bone into the vibrant world, their landing zones instantly killing the glowing flora beneath them. She saw the mycelians' initial response not fear, but a wave of profound, welcoming curiosity that washed over the Ethel explorers. The psychic broadcast was so pure, so open, that the Ethel sensors registered it as a chaotic, unintelligible data storm, a biological weapon. They had met a song with a shield, and an open hand with a clenched fist. Vexia watched, paralyzed, as the historical narrative she had so carefully constructed was dismantled frame by agonizing frame. The purification, the cleansing, was shown for what it was: a panicked, brutal extermination born from a fundamental misunderstanding. The nanophage was not a cure. It was a poison that targeted the planet's neural network of roots, silencing the world song and killing the planetary mind. The psychic scream she had experienced was not an echo. It was a live recording, and the spore on her bridge was the sole surviving memory cell. She finally tore her gaze away from the horrifyingly beautiful vision, her breath coming in ragged, un-Ethel-like gasps. Her entire life, her entire civilization's moral foundation, was a lie built upon a single, catastrophic act of ignorance. The silence they cherished was not the sound of peace. It was the sound of a grave. With a newfound, desperate purpose, Vexia turned from the bridge, leaving the catatonic crew to their waking nightmare. She had to answer the question, "Where did you plant our heart?" It was no longer a phantom query. It was the only question that mattered. If the spore was a memory cell, then the heart must be the core of the mycelian consciousness, the primary nexus of the world mind. The archives had said the species was diffuse, with no central brain, but the archives were a fabrication. She strode through the corridors of the sanctum, and the ship's transformation was now undeniable. The bone-white polymer of the walls had taken on a pearlescent sheen, and when she touched the surface, it felt cool and slightly pliant, like the cap of a mushroom. Faint, glowing patterns of mycelial threads spread across the floor like ghostly circuits, pulsing in time with the low thrumming that now filled the ship. The silence was gone, replaced by a soundscape of soft chimes, deep hums, and a persistent, watery dripping that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. The ship was not just being haunted, it was being terraformed from within, its sterile technology being slowly, inexorably colonized by the biological memory of Mycos. She reached the entrance to the deep archives, the repository of the hegemony's most guarded secrets. Records sealed even from the High Adjudicator without explicit council authorization. The door was a seamless slab of polished obsidian, locked by a quantum-entangled psychic key. To open it was an act of supreme treason, a rejection of the very order she was sworn to uphold. But the order was a lie. Her loyalty was to the truth, however ugly it might be. Placing her palm on the door, she closed her eyes, not to project the authorized access code, but to focus on the memory the spore had shown her, the grief, the beauty, the loss. She let the mycelian song flow through her, not resisting it, but channeling it. The door did not recognize her authority, but it recognized the ghost she now carried within her. With a deep, groaning sound, like the shifting of ancient stone, the obsidian slab dissolved into a cloud of black motes and vanished. Vexia stepped inside, into the true heart of the hegemony's silence, The air was cold and dead, and the crystalline data matrices here were not white, but a deep blood red, pulsing with the repressed truths of centuries of conquest. She moved to the central console, the stench of sterile history thick in the air. Accessing file, the mycelium cleansing, Appendix Gamma 7 level redaction. She commanded, her voice echoing in the vast, forbidden space. The console remained dark. Access denied. Her authority, even in this sanctum of lies, was insufficient. Frustration, another messy, chaotic emotion, welled up inside her. "Show me the heart," she whispered, not to the console, but to the nascent life growing within the ship's walls, to the memory that now watched through her eyes. The room responded. The glowing mycelial patterns that had begun to trace the corridors flowed into the chamber, converging on the console before her. They climbed its base, their soft blue light overpowering the red glow of the redacted files. The console flickered, and lines of hegemony code dissolved, replaced by a swirling, organic interface of light and shadow. The entity was not just corrupting their data, it was translating it, tearing away the layers of linguistic deceit to reveal the raw information beneath. A single file materialized on the screen, its title not written in Aethelgard, but formed from a complex, living ideogram of a root system clutching a glowing sphere. The file name was Specimen Prime. Vexia opened it. There were no reports, no analyses, just a single, continuous biotelemetry log and a star chart. The log showed a single life sign, impossibly powerful, ancient, and trapped. It was not dead, but held in a state of perpetual, dreamless stasis. The star chart showed its location. It was a place Vexia knew well, a place no one would ever think to look for a world god's stolen heart. The coordinates were not for some forgotten black site or remote prison asteroid. They were for Aethelgard Prime, the throne world, the heart of the hegemony itself. And the telemetry log confirmed the impossible Specimen Prime was integrated directly into the Citadel's primary power core, the very engine that sustained the hegemony's capital and its illusion of perfect, sterile order. They hadn't just buried the heart, they had enslaved it, turning a god into a battery, forcing the soul of a living world to power the civilization that had murdered it. The ceremonial pilgrimage of the sanctum was a lie. Its true, unspoken mission was to pass by this sector, to monitor the stasis field around the heart, ensuring the god remained asleep. But something had gone wrong. The god was stirring, and its first dream was of revenge. The revelation struck Vexia with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless in the crimson glow of the deep archive. The hegemony was not just built on a lie, it was powered by it. The placid, harmonious energy that flowed through the throne world, the very lifeblood of their civilization, was the stolen, sleeping life force of a murdered world. The silence of Aethelgard Prime was the silence of a gagged prisoner in a dungeon. She saw it now with sickening clarity. The hegemony's entire philosophy of purification and order was a psychological defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to justify an act of deicide so profound it had to be erased from their own history. They were not stewards of peace. They were parasites, drawing sustenance from a soul they kept in a perpetual, dreamless coma. Her role as high adjudicator, the curator of their history, was not that of a scholar, but of a prison warden, tasked with ensuring the chains of forgetting remained locked tight. But the prisoner was waking up, And the walls of the prison, the very ship she commanded, were beginning to remember what they were made of. A low, resonant hum began to build in the chamber, emanating from the glowing mycelial network that now covered the console and snaked up the walls. The voice of the mycelian collective spoke in her mind, no longer a sorrowful whisper, but a focused, resonant chord of burgeoning awareness. "You have seen the crime," it stated, a declaration devoid of malice yet heavy with the weight of an unbreakable verdict. "Now you will witness the consequence." The ship, the sanctum, lurched, not with the shudder of a mechanical failure, but with the deliberate, muscular contraction of a living thing. Alarms, which had been silent for centuries, began to blare throughout the vessel, harsh. Atonal shrieks that were the antithesis of ethel harmony. Emergency lights cast the corridors in a strobing, chaotic red, illuminating the accelerating transformation. The bone-white polymer of the ship's interior was now almost completely obscured by a thick, velvety layer of bioluminescent moss, and structures that looked like the caps of immense mushrooms were pushing their way through the ceilings, dripping a phosphorescent dew that hissed when it touched the remaining sterile surfaces. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, wet earth, and something else, something ancient and wild. The sanctum was no longer an archival vessel. It was becoming an incubator, a womb for a resurrected world. Vexia stumbled out of the deep archive, her mind racing to process the strategic implications of her discovery. The ship was no longer under her control. Its navigation, its life support, its very structural integrity were now being dictated by the awakening consciousness of the mycelian entity. She made her way back to the command bridge, moving through a ship that felt more like a primeval forest than a product of hegemony engineering. She passed crew members who were beginning to stir from their psychic shock, but they were not returning to their former selves. Their pale skin was now faintly luminous, traced with the same glowing patterns that covered the walls. Their eyes, once a calm, uniform silver, now held a swirling, nebula-like depth. They moved with a strange, new grace, their bodies swaying in time with the ship's low hum, as if responding to a song only they could hear. They were not being possessed. They were being integrated. The mycelian consciousness, denied its own world, was weaving itself into the fabric of the ethel, turning its jailers into a new kind of symbiotic host. They looked at Vexia as she passed, their expressions not of fear or hostility, but of a deep, unsettling pity. They were part of the song now, and she was still deaf to the music. When she reached the bridge, the transformation was complete. The sleek, minimalist chamber was gone, replaced by a grotto of living light. The floor was soft moss. The control consoles were overgrown with glowing fungal structures, and the ceiling was a canopy of immense, gently pulsing mushroom caps. The holographic window no longer showed the star-dusted void of the Viridian Veil. It showed the swirling, chaotic vortex of slipstream space, rendered not in the precise, clinical lines of a nav chart, but as a maelstrom of raw, cosmic energy. In the center of the room, where the holographic spore had floated, now stood Lyran. He had been changed the most. His body was a tapestry of light and flesh, his robes intertwined with living, glowing vines. He was the focal point, the anchor through which the mycelian consciousness was interfacing with the ship. He turned to face Vexia, his eyes burning with the light of 1,000,000,000 souls. When he spoke, it was with the voice of the collective. The heart calls to us. They said, "We are going home." Vexia looked at the swirling chaos of the slipstream window. "You will never reach the throne world," she stated, her voice regaining a measure of its former authority. "The core fleet will intercept you. They will tear this ship apart." The hegemony's military was absolute, its power unquestioned, a single, corrupted archival vessel, no matter how transformed, stood no chance against the full might of the fleet. "Your ships are made of metal and fire," Lyron's voice replied, a serene, untroubled melody. "They are loud. They are predictable. Our ship is now made of life and silence. We will not fly through their grasp. We will grow through the cracks in their perception." As he spoke, the nature of their slipstream travel seemed to change. The violent, tearing sensation of high-velocity transit smoothed out into a gentle, flowing current. It felt less like they were moving through space and more like space was flowing around them. On the view screen, the chaotic vortex resolved into something else entirely. It was a network, a vast, galaxy-spanning web of faint, silvery lines that looked like the roots of an immense tree. Vexia realized with a jolt of disbelief what she was looking at. It was the subspace mycelial network, a theoretical dimension of interconnected life that hegemony science had dismissed as primitive superstition. The mycelians had not needed starships. They had traveled along the hidden veins of the universe itself. The sanctum, by virtue of its partial transformation, was now able to perceive and navigate this living dimension. They were not just faster than the hegemony fleet. They were operating on a plane of existence the hegemony didn't even believe was real. As if to prove the point, the view screen shifted, showing them an image of real space. They were passing a hegemony deep space listening post, a massive station bristling with sensors. Dozens of Aethelgard warships patrolled the surrounding sector, their engines burning bright against the black. They were hunting, searching for the rogue vessel Sanctum. Yet, as Vexia watched, her transformed ship slipped past them like a ghost, unnoticed and undetected. They were so close she could see the insignia on the capital ship's hull, yet the patrol showed no sign of alarm. To them, the Sanctum did not exist. It was a whisper in a dimension they could not hear. "Your hegemony is blind." The mycelian voice spoke through Lyron, a hint of something that might have been sadness in its tone. "You have silenced so much of the universe that you can no longer see its true shape. You have built a fortress of order in a single room, while the living world thrives, unseen, just outside your door." Vexia stood in the center of the living bridge, a solitary island of sterile white in a world of vibrant, glowing life. She was the last true Ethel aboard a ship of converts, a relic of a dead philosophy. She had two choices. She could fight, clinging to the wreckage of her broken worldview, and be consumed by the life that was blooming all around her. Or she could do the unthinkable. She could listen to the song. She could learn the truth of the silence she had so long worshipped. And she could try, in some small way, to atone for the sin of her entire civilization. "What do you want?" she asked, the question a surrender and a plea. Lyron smiled, and for the first time, the expression was his own, a flicker of the young acolyte she had known, now gazing at her from within the heart of a god. "We do not want revenge," he said, his voice now a soft harmony of his own and the collective's. We want to be whole, and we want our children to see the sky. Vexia's question hung in the humid, living air of the bridge, a fragile thread of logic in a tapestry of burgeoning, overwhelming life. The answer, when it came, was not a demand or a threat, but a vision. The living walls of the grotto bridge shimmered, and the image of the subspace network dissolved, replaced by a projection that bloomed in the center of the chamber. It was Aethelgard Prime, the throne world, but shown from a perspective Vexia had never imagined. The vision pierced the planet's crust, peeling back the layers of sterile, white cityscape to reveal the core. There, suspended in a cage of crackling energy and arcane hegemony technology, was the heart. It was a crystalline sphere the size of a small moon, its surface a lattice of dormant, petrified roots. Within its depths, a faint, rhythmic light pulsed, a slow, deep, and impossibly weary heartbeat that powered a civilization. But the vision showed more. It showed the psychic agony of the heart, a silent, ceaseless scream of confinement that was the true source of the hegemony's vaunted peace, a forced tranquility born from a constant, planet-wide suppression of a god's suffering. The Ethel were not living in harmony. They were living in the shadow of a torture chamber, mistaking the muffled screams of their victim for a pleasant, ambient hum. Then, the vision shifted. It showed what would happen when the sanctum, now less a ship and more a living seed of Mycos, arrived. The vessel would not attack the planet in a conventional sense. It would plunge into the atmosphere, its living hull burning away, not in destruction, but in dissemination. It would release a cloud of life-giving spores, a resurrected memory of a world that would rain down upon the sterile plains and bone-white cities of the throne world. The spores would not be a weapon of war. They would be an antidote to the hegemony's sterility. They would find purchase in the cracks of the plazas, in the sterile soil of the ornamental gardens, and in the recycled water of the purification canals. And they would grow. The vision accelerated, showing months passing in mere seconds. A faint green-blue fuzz would appear on the pristine white architecture, then vines, then glowing moss, then the first tentative caps of nascent mushrooms pushing through the pavement. The hegemony would fight back, deploying their purification squads with their chemical sprays and plasma burners. They would scorch the new life from their cities. But for every patch they sterilized, 2 more would bloom elsewhere. They could not win, because the spores would carry not just life, but a memory, the song of the mycelian collective. And this was the crux of the entity's plan. The song would seep into the collective ethel consciousness, not as a psychic scream of vengeance, but as a gentle, persistent whisper of the truth. It would show them the beauty of the world they had destroyed. It would make them feel the sorrow of their deicidal act. It would not break their minds with trauma, as it had done to the crew of the Sanctum, but would slowly, gently, dismantle the lie that held their civilization together. It would be a revolution of empathy. A war fought not with weapons, but with memory and grief. As the planet's surface began to bloom with a riot of resurrected life, the psychic resonance of the song would grow, feeding back into the dormant heart at the planet's core. The vision showed the final, spectacular moments. The energy cage around the heart would flicker and die, its power source, the hegemony's own will to dominate, eroded by a dawning collective guilt. The crystalline heart would crack open, not in an explosion, but in a glorious, silent blossoming. A wave of pure, unadulterated life force would erupt from the planet's core, a psychic wave of joy and relief so powerful it would be felt across the galaxy. The Aethelgard throne world would not be destroyed. It would be transformed. It would become a new Mycos, a hybrid world of Ethel and Mycelian, a monument not to conquest, but to atonement. The vision faded, leaving Vexia standing in the soft, blue-green light of her living ship, the enormity of the plan settling upon her like a physical weight. The Mycelians were not seeking to replace the hegemony. They were seeking to heal them. "You cannot control this," Vexia finally said, her voice a dry rasp. "You are unleashing a force of nature upon a society that has forgotten what nature is. The chaos, the panic. My people will not understand it as a gift. They will see it as an invasion, and they will fight to the last to preserve their silence." She thought of the billions of Ethel on the throne world, their lives built upon the fragile perfection of a lie. To have that foundation shattered so completely would be a fate worse than death. It would be the death of their very identity. Lyran, the Mycelian anchor, turned his luminous eyes toward her. "They will not be alone," he said, his voice a gentle counterpoint to her rising fear. "We will be with them. We will guide them through the pain of remembering. And you will be our voice." Vexia recoiled as if struck. I am the architect of the lie you seek to dismantle. I am the high adjudicator of a history of sin. They will see me as a traitor, a heretic. They will see you as a witness." Lyran corrected. "You know the depths of their deception because you carved it into stone. You feel the weight of their crime because you carried it as a virtue. When the song begins, they will need someone who can translate the music, someone who can explain the pain, someone who can show them that the shattering of their world is not an end, but a beginning." The logic was as terrifying as it was inescapable. She was the only one who could bridge the gap between the two realities, the only one who had stood with a foot in both worlds. To her people, she would be the ultimate apostate, the voice of the alien corruptor. To the Mycelians, she would be a tool, a mouthpiece for their great, cosmic act of rebalancing. In either case, the Vexia she had been the serene, certain, powerful matriarch of memory was already dead. A new role was being thrust upon her, one forged in the crucible of a truth she had spent her life denying. A choice was before her to be the last guardian of a beautiful, genocidal lie, or the first apostle of a painful, redemptive truth. She looked around the living bridge, at the crew members who were now so much more than Ethel, their faces filled with a placid, vibrant serenity that made their old hegemony-enforced calm seem like a hollow imitation. They were not slaves to this new consciousness. They were partners. They had lost their sterile individuality, but had gained a connection to a life force vaster than any of them had ever conceived. They had found a new, truer silence in the heart of the song, with a slow, deliberate movement that felt like the most significant act of her long life. Vexia reached up and unfastened the silver clasp that held her white high adjudicator's robes. The garment slid from her shoulders and pooled at her feet, a puddle of shed identity on the soft, mossy floor. She stood before the Mycelian anchor in the simple, gray tunic of a common archivist, stripped of her rank and her authority, but feeling, for the first time, unburdened. "What must I do?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. No longer the command of a ruler, but the query of a student. Lyran stepped forward, and for a moment, the immense, ancient power of the collective receded, and she saw only the young acolyte, his eyes filled with a sad, knowing wisdom. He reached out and placed his hand not on her, but on the living wall of the ship beside her. A single, luminous vine detached itself from the wall and snaked toward Vexia, its tip glowing with a soft, golden light. It stopped before her, hovering at the level of her heart. "The song must be complete," Lyran whispered. "The memory of Mycos is awake. The dream of the Ethel is ending. But for the new world to be born, the two must become one. The ghost must have a body. The heart must have a voice." The vine pulsed with a gentle, inviting light. It was an invitation to join the song, to become a part of the consciousness that was about to remake a galaxy. It was the final, irrevocable step. Vexia closed her eyes, took a deep breath that was rich with the scent of life, and nodded. The vine surged forward, and a light that was not a light and a sound that was not a sound filled her being, as the silence of a single, lonely soul was finally, and forever, broken by the chorus of a world. The touch of the glowing vine was not a physical sensation, but a spiritual one, a point of entry into a state of being. Vexia's meticulously ordered language had no words for it was not an invasion, but an invitation. Her singular consciousness, a polished, solitary stone, was gently submerged into a boundless ocean of awareness. She did not drown, she dissolved, her edges blurring until she was both the stone and the sea. She was still Vexia, but her eye now contained the memory of a world. She felt the cool, dark soil of Mycos, the joy of a sun-drenched canopy, the slow, deep communion of a billion roots intertwined in a silent, planetary mind song. She also felt the searing agony of the nanophage, the confusion of a world mind being ripped apart, and the long, cold, dreamless sleep of its stolen heart. The lie she had curated her entire life was no longer an intellectual concept to be deconstructed. It was a scar on her own soul, a phantom limb whose pain she now felt with excruciating clarity. The transformation was complete. She was no longer just a witness or a translator. She was a living bridge, the point of fusion between two impossibilities, a species that had forgotten how to feel and a species that was nothing but feeling. When the sanctum, now a vessel of woven light and life, a ghost in the hegemony's machine, arrived, the sight of Aethelgard Prime was almost unbearable. From the subspace network, they emerged into the silent void of real space, and the throne world hung before them like a flawless pearl built around a heart of agony. Its perfect, white surface, crisscrossed with lines of pure energy, was a mask of serene order, hiding an unspeakable, ongoing crime. Vexia, through her new, expanded senses, could feel the constant, low-level psychic suppression field that emanated from the Citadel, a smothering blanket designed to keep the heart docile and the populace placid. The core fleet, hundreds of pristine, knife-edged warships, floated in perfect, silent formation around the planet, guardians of a peace they did not understand. They were blind and deaf, their powerful sensors unable to detect the living ship that now pulsed with a purpose antithetical to their entire existence. The time for stealth was over. The time for the song had come. "Begin," Vexia whispered, and the word was spoken not by her mouth, but by the collective mind, a command that rippled through the living ship. The sanctum did not fire a weapon. It did not raise a shield. It moved toward the throne world with the gentle, inexorable purpose of a falling seed. As it entered the upper atmosphere, the core fleet finally detected the anomaly, a biological energy signature where none should be. Alarms they had never needed to use shrieked across their silent bridges. Weapons charged, but they were too late. The sanctum began to burn, not with the destructive fire of re-entry, but with a glorious generative light. The hull, now more bark and mycelium than metal, peeled away in shimmering, incandescent flakes. The ship became a final, beautiful exhalation, a dying breath that gave birth to a new world, a rain of 1 billion glowing spores, each a microscopic vessel of memory and life, descended upon the sterile capital. The sanctum ceased to exist, its purpose fulfilled. Its crew, including the body of Lyran, were now part of the Sporefall, their physical forms given back to the song. As the first spores touched the bone-white plazas and sterile rooftops, the second phase of the plan began. Vexia, now a disembodied nexus of consciousness, reached out and seized control of every communication channel in the system military frequencies, civilian broadcasts, archival records, public address systems. Her voice, amplified by the psychic power of the mycelian collective, boomed across the planet and into the minds of every Ethel. "I am High Adjudicator Vexia," the voice declared, a title used not as a claim to authority, but as a key to unlock their minds. "I have come to amend the archives. The official history of our people is incomplete. The silence you cherish is a lie. Our peace is a prison. Today, the prisoner is set free. Listen." And then came the song. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a direct, undeniable broadcast of the truth. Every Ethel on the planet and in the fleet suddenly saw the world of Mykos in all its beauty. They felt the welcoming curiosity of the world mind, and then they felt the fire, the poison, the pain of their ancestors' crime, a shared memory delivered as a single, devastating psychic blow. Chaos erupted. The serene order of Aethelgard Prime shattered into 1 billion pieces. Ethel collapsed in the streets, clutching their heads, their minds reeling from the sudden, violent influx of empathy and guilt. On the bridges of the warships, disciplined officers screamed as the psychic screams of the dying mycelians echoed in their own consciousness. And as their collective psychic certainty wavered, the purification field that held the heart in check began to fail. Simultaneously, across the planet, the spores began to grow. Glowing, iridescent moss bloomed in seconds, cracking the perfect white pavement. Luminous vines snaked up the sterile towers, and the caps of mushrooms the size of hovercars pushed through the roofs of administrative buildings. The planet was waking up. The core fleet, its command structure in disarray, tried to fight back. They fired their purification rays at the planet. But the beams that were designed to sterilize were now met with an explosion of life, the energy only accelerating the impossible growth. Deep within the planet's core, the heart felt the touch of its children, the song of its own memory returning. The energy cage did not shatter. It withered like a dead branch. Its power source, the Ethel's unified will, now a cacophony of confusion and dawning horror. With a silent, planet-shaking surge, the crystalline sphere cracked open. A wave of pure life, of unrestrained joy and ancient grief finally released, erupted from the core and washed over the planet and the fleet. It was not an attack. It was a baptism. It overloaded every system, silenced every weapon, and touched every Ethel soul. It did not kill them. It showed them everything. It healed the psychic wound they hadn't known they carried by forcing them to finally acknowledge it. Vexia, at the heart of the psychic symphony, guided the wave, tempering its power, shaping its intent from pure retribution into a chance for redemption. Her final broadcast was not one of judgment, but of hope. The lie is broken. Her voice resonated through their transformed minds. The pain is real, but the silence is over. Now, we learn a new way. We learn to listen. We learn to grow. The last image the galaxy saw of Aethelgard Prime before its light transformed was of a world of white towers and glowing, living forests. Intertwined, the warships of the core fleet floated silently in orbit, their engines dark, their crews weeping as they watched their sterile world be reborn into something vibrant, messy, and alive. The silence was dead. Long live the song.